Our next speaker is Flora Cassen, who is Assistant Professor of History and Van der Horst Fellow in Jewish History and Culture at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She earned her PhD from NYU with a dissertation that studied the discriminatory marks that the Jews were compelled to wear in 15th and 16th century Italy, and probes the roots and consequences of anti-Judaism. It's being prepared for publication as Marking the Jews: Politics, Religion, and the Power of Symbols in Renaissance Italy. Her article on the meaning of the symbols used to distinguish the Jews in Italy appeared last year in an edited volume on fashioning the Jews. Her next project studies Italian Jews who were spies for the King of Spain, records she discovered in Italian archives and further documented in Spanish archives. Her talk today is The Sausage in the Jews' Pantry: Food and Jewish-Christian Relations in Renaissance Italy. Flora.
Thank you. When I go out to dinner with friends, our first decision is to choose which cuisine we're going to have. We're going to have French, Italian, Indian, Asian, or American cuisines. The choices are endless. Excitement for global cuisines is a phenomenon of our time. It's a cultural experience that we believe enriches our palates and teaches us to appreciate the diversity of the world. But this was not so in the early modern world. In his new work on Ottoman travel narratives, Eric Derstellers shows that travelers so closely connected diet to a person's ethnic identity that they sometimes worry that if they ate too much of it, it would change their own identity. To give a modern comparison, eating sushi will not turn a Portuguese into a Japanese. It's just a cultural and culinary experience. Medieval and early modern concepts of a healthful diet were largely based on theories from antiquity, especially the idea that the body's four humors, or liquid, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, must be balanced through nutrition. All foods were classified according to the humor they were thought to affect, and the diet was adjusted according to what fluid was thought to be lacking or overabundant. Marsilio Ficino, a 15th century humanist who lived in Florence, translated a lot of Plato's works, even argued that the cure for old age was to drink young blood. He said, I quote, "Why shouldn't our old people, namely those who have no recourse, likewise suck the blood of the young?" And people didn't do it, but it just shows you how food was connected not only to nourishment, but also to character. And this, I will argue in this paper, had important consequences for Jewish-Christian relations in Renaissance Italy. For eating the same food was a sign of trust, but people who ate differently were suspicious. What you ate defined not only who you were, but also who you were not. Mangiare alla Judia, or eating in the Jewish style, meant not only that you were Jewish, but also that you were not Christian. So mangiare alla Judia was a concept of sameness and difference, just as much as it was a style of food. And to clarify the place of food in Jewish-Christian relations, I'm going to discuss three questions. First, was there a specific Italian Jewish cuisine in Renaissance Italy? And if so, what was it? What did they eat? Did all Jews eat that way? That's my second question. And third, did food act as a barrier or as a bridge between Jews and Christians? So today, right, if you're in Italy, you're a tourist, you want to eat Jewish food, you want to mangiare alla Judia, people will tell you you have to go to the Roman ghetto. However, a quick overview of the food of the Roman ghetto illustrates just how complicated the concept of Jewish food is. Piperno, the oldest restaurant in the ghetto, sells a number of dishes that it says have a Jewish origin. The carciofi alla Judia, artichokes in the Jewish style, carne secca, beef that's salted and dried, pasta with chickpeas, stuffed zucchini, fried cod, and fried mozzarella. The carciofi, or the artichokes, are the most famous Jewish Italian dish. In fact, every year, pretty much, the New York Times has an article on them with a recipe, and you can see this year's recipe just from April the 8th. For Passover, you can have fried artichokes, so you basically need to use a sharp knife, cut the hard leaves of the artichokes, and then fry them in oil. And the carciofi have actually been associated with Jews and prepared pretty much the same way since at least the 16th century. And so I put on this slide a recipe that was found in the margin of a 16th century manuscript, and that tells you how to make the carciofi à la Judea. And first it tells you what's the best season to pick it, right, between February and June. But same thing, you need to cut the hard leaves and then fry them in boiling oil. So easy recipe, and it didn't change very much over time. The carne seca was a meat preparation derived from Jewish dietary regulation that required salting the meat to remove the blood. But the other specialty, so the carciofi and the carne seca probably had a Jewish origin, but the other specialties, the fried cod, the fried mozzarella, the zucchini, were traditional Roman fare, also adopted by Jews. Now, to complicate things even more, if you look at Piperno's menu, it also serves many dishes with prosciutto and shellfish, which are foods that are absolutely forbidden by Jewish religion. Now, on the other hand, Mama Kosher Food, a kosher restaurant of the Roman ghetto, specializes in beef sandwiches and burgers, which is American cuisine. And another kosher restaurant, Baghetto, sells falafel, hummus, and other Israeli or Middle Eastern specialties. So in the Roman ghetto, you can get authentic Roman food that is not kosher, or kosher food, but that is not from Rome. But all I've done so far is showing that today Jewish food is a complicated concept. Was there more clarity in the early modern world? In his book Mangiare alla Giudia, Jewish Food from the Renaissance to Today, Ariel Taaf argued that eating kosher and eating Jewish were two different, even if often overlapping things. So kosher, as we've discussed already, designated compliance with the dietary regulations of the Hebrew Bible. Jewish style, or Mangiare alla Giudia, on the other hand, was a cuisine heavily reliant on local eating habits and ingredients combined with influences or ingredients that originated in the places where the Jews had come from. But by the 15th and 16th centuries, Italian Jewry had become a true melting pot. The Italiani were the Italian Jews. They claimed to have been there since Roman time and to be the real true Italian Jews. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Jews expelled from France and Germany, crossed the Alps, settled into the peninsula, and same after the expulsion from Spain in 1492, Spanish Jews, Sicilian Jews, that in fact Sicily was part of Spain at the time, moved up and settled into the peninsula. Later, Levantine Jews, usually from the Ottoman Empire, moved to Italy to establish commercial trading posts, and they too stayed. And so these different groups intermingled, but they also kept some memory of where they came from and some of their culinary traditions. And the carciofi alla Judea, for example, are believed to have come from Sicily, where originally they were an Arabic dish, and that's how slowly on other Jewish groups adopted it, and it became the iconic Italian Jewish food. A Hebrew-Italian dictionary published in Venice in 1579 contained a detailed list of the foods that the Jews ate at the time. And it included turnip, chard, dill, lettuce, endive, pumpkins, watermelons, cucumbers, roots, onions, leeks, garlics, dried fruits, apples, pears, olives, dates, almonds, chestnut pasta, eggs, meat, bread, and wine. So a very varied diet. But the dishes that we most closely associate with Jewish food today, the artichokes or the zucchini, they were not on the list. And this suggests, and most historians of Italian Jewry agree, that by and large, Jews ate a diet very similar to the diet of their non-Jewish neighbors. So maybe we need to turn to the rules of kashrut, the dietary regulations of the Hebrew Bible, to see more consistent differences between the Jews' diet and the diet of the rest of the Italian population. Leon Modena, a Venetian rabbi of the 17th century, wrote a compilation of Jewish rituals for a Christian audience. So he wrote this book in which he explained Jewish rituals to non-Jews. And so chapter 7 of the foods that are always forbidden and how we eat meat presents an overview of the kashrut rules related to meat. So he says meat, excluding pork, horse, and rabbit, could only be eaten if the animals had been slaughtered properly, which meant that their trachea and esophagus had been slashed with a very sharp knife so as to drain the blood, and the animal was found to be healthy upon careful inspection after the slaughter. Then many parts, such as fat and sinews, had to be discarded too. And it is for this reason, writes Modena, I quote, that in many parts of Italy, and especially in Germany, we do not eat the hind quarter of the animal, for there are a lot of nerves and fat there. In chapter 8, on drinking, he explains why Italian Jews were different than other Jews, and in fact transgressed the rules. And I'm going to quote, there are those that by the orders of the ancient rabbis argue that it is forbidden for Jews to drink wine made or touched by a non-Jew. And this rule is observed by Jews in the Levant and in Germany. But in Italy, we do not comply. For we argue that it was ordered by rabbis who lived among idolaters to forbid trade with them, not for the nations amongst whom we live today. So in Italy, Jews and Christians drank the same wine, but they ate different meat. Now, right, if you think about it, and we're in the 15th and 16th centuries, the rules regarding kosher meat were prohibitive. To eat kosher meat, Jews had to have their own slaughterhouse and a much larger supply of animals than Christians, because a significant amount of the animal had to be discarded. And usually Jewish butchers received permission to sell the parts that Jews couldn't eat to Christians, but not always, because it was a source of a lot of suspicion, right? If they can't eat it, why can we? Are they trying to poison us? And so on. And if the butchers could not sell the parts of the animal that they didn't eat to Christians, the cost of a pound of kosher meat was out of reach, even for the wealthiest Jews. And so I think it's reasonable to ask, could the Jewish communities of Italy realistically ensure a supply of enough kosher meat to the Jewish populations? And this leads to the second question I asked, did all Jews eat that way? I'd like to preface this by saying that there were two groups of Jews in Italy. Those who lived in larger Jewish communities, and increasingly in the 16th and 17th century, these Jews lived in ghettos. And then the second group were Jews who lived alone. Very small groups of families, sometimes one or two Jews in a small village. And while the structure and lifestyles of the larger, often ghettoized Jewish communities are well known, these lonely Jews or micro-communities have been mostly ignored. In larger Jewish communities, and especially in the ghettos that were introduced at the beginning of the 16th century and then spread rapidly to the rest of Italy, and I'm not going to go over that slide, but it just tells you where ghettos were created and when. The Jews could and did establish the structures that were necessary to provide kosher food. Ghetto life was not as bad as it sounds today. Explicitly, ghettos were created to make the Jews' life so miserable that they would convert to Christianity, but as many historians have shown, the opposite happened. The ghettos of Italy became a kind of religious and cultural haven for Jews who had grown tired of the pressures of the outside, right? Convert, wear a yellow badge, lend money at interest rates so low that you can support yourself, cure the sick for free, pay fees every few years for the permission to live here, and so on. And in the ghettos, they were given a break, and this strengthened their religious and cultural lives. Yet ghetto life was not all that rosy either. The space was cramped, and the material conditions were difficult, and over time this led to an impoverishment of the Jewish communities, which was noticeable in the food. And in many ways, the traditional food of Italian Jews, the traditional food of the Jewish ghettos, was also the traditional food of poor Italians. But as I said, many Italian Jews did not live in ghettos. In the course of my studies in this region, actually, Milan and Piedmont and Genova, I encountered numerous Jews who lived either in very small settlements of a family or two families, or sometimes completely alone in a village. As Ariel Taaf wrote in his book on the Jews of Umbria, I quote, "The Jewish presence in Italy in the late Middle Ages was distinguished by the breadth of its dispersion. Settlements, often limited to single families, were spread over a considerable number of city-states, walled towns and villages linked by poor or inconvenient communications." And Stephanie Sigmund observed the same phenomenon in Florence, and in her book she says, in fact, we can't even call these Jewish settlements community, we should call them constellations because of how lonely and dispersed they were. And it seems intuitive that these constellations of Jews, these isolated Jews, would not eat a la Judea or kosher, but eat like everyone else. And so to probe that assertion, I want to tell you the story of the Nantua brothers, and they're the Jews who had sausage in their pantry. So Lazzaro and Angelino Nantua lived in a small town, probably not too far from here, called Gavi. They ran a pawn shop together, they lived in the same house, and there were no other Jews in Gavi, so their house was the only Jewish house in town. In 1567, the Republic of Genova ordered the expulsion of all the Jews from Genova, but the people of Gavi actually sent a petition and asked that they could stay because they had such good relations with them. But over time, their situation worsened, and one day, apparently Angelino got into a fight with the chancellor of the city and hit him, causing him to bleed and suffer a swollen eye. And so after this, the Doge ordered that Angelino be put in prison and that all their stuff be confiscated. And so to do that confiscation, a detailed inventory of everything in their house was taken. And it showed that they had so many things, and most of those things were pawned. So it's people who owed them money and couldn't repay them who had given them their things, that there were chests and chests of clothes, jewelry, furniture, a big cache of weapons, and Jews weren't allowed theoretically to have weapons, but it seems that, you know, if you're the only Jews in a town and your money lenders and a lot of people's possessions end up in your house, they were tough guys, I think, and they probably needed this for protection. The only Jewish ritual object that they had was a chest with the 5 books of Moses. And although they were identified and they also self-identified as Jews, it's hard to imagine what for them Jewish life meant or felt like. And maybe the contents of their pantry and their wine cellar will give us more information. Surely if they had kosher food there, it would be evidence of Jewish practice and identity. So their wine cellar was very well stocked. And this is all the wines that they had, so you can tell many barrels, big barrels, smaller barrels, lots of wine in it, and some even belonged to people from the town that they seem to be storing it for them. Right, so you see that they had a lot of wine there. And in their pantry, and that's the really interesting part, they had 4 rub of Piacentino's cheese, a style of nectar in a saddlebag, a rub and a half of sausage, 2 rub of salted beef, a style of wheat in a bag, and another bag with half a style of wheat. So it was mostly dried food, which is to be expected in a small village. Fresh food was a luxury. Piacentino cheese came from Sicily, so their diet wasn't limited to locally produced food. The salted beef was probably carne seca, which I discussed before, beef that was salted to remove the blood and then dried for preservation. And then there was the sausage. And the question is, what's in that sausage? Surely, this had to be pork bought from their neighborhood butchery, or was it? In Mangiare alla Giudia, Toaf has an entire chapter on goose meat, which he calls the Jew's pig. And he provides ample evidence that in the 15th and 16th centuries, the Jews of Lombardy and Piedmont specialized in breeding geese and in the large-scale commercialization of foie gras, sausages, salamis, and dried meat, all made from geese. For example, in 1501, Abraham Sacerdoti from Alessandria, a small town in the Duchy of Milan, was exempted from paying any kind of duties when going from town to sell dried or fresh goose meat. And by the beginning of the 17th century, the ghetto of Carmagnola in Piedmont had become the largest producer of goose salami. And if you look at the map that I show here, so the 3 places I just mentioned, Alessandria, here, Gavi here, Carmagnola there, they're all in Piedmont today, but at the time, Alessandria was actually part of the Duchy of Milan, Gavi was part of Genova, but these places, you see they're actually quite close, and where the brothers lived in Gavi was kind of in the center of that market, and so in fact they could easily have procured goose sausage, and so it's possible, maybe even likely, that even lonely and tough mountain Jews ate kosher meat. So although these isolated Jewish settlements cannot be called communities, the Jews who lived in them shared a sense of sameness and belonging with Jews in other small settlements or in ghettos. This sense of sameness was strengthened and maintained through active networks by which they acquired kosher meat, maybe sustained business or family contacts, arranged marriages, and so on. And food appears to have been a central element in the creation and also maintenance of these networks between dispersed groups of Jews. So let me get now to my third and final question. What does everything I've told you tell us about the function and place of food in Jewish-Christian relations in Italy at the time? I started by saying that in the early modern world, eating the same was a sign of trust, but eating differently was a sign of suspicion. Since Jews and Christians shared many culinary habits, this should have generated trust between the two groups, and indeed it did. Evidence such as lists of fines that Jews had to pay for mixing, conversing, and eating with Christians suggest that Jews and Christians shared meals on a regular basis, and the problem was not just sharing meals, but mixing and conversing, a kind of breaking up of religious boundaries. But even the ghetto boundaries were quite porous. Christians were curious about what the Jews did and ate in the ghetto. In his book on the Inquisition of Venice, Brian Pullen cites numerous examples of Christians visiting the ghetto and conversing with Jews. The Inquisition recorded the cases and issued warnings, but didn't condemn these people. However, if a Christian slept or ate in the ghetto, condemnation was inevitable. For example, he gives the example of a Christian woman, Valeria Brunelleschi, who confessed to the Inquisition that she lived in the ghetto for 2 years during which she taught Jewish girls to read from the Old Testament, and during that time she ate and drank food and wine that the Jews supplied her. The food, she said, I quote, was fish and matzot, but never meat, end of quote. One of the most remarkable events that Poland cites is an annual ritual that took place at the end of Passover, and during which Christian bakers entered the ghetto with baskets of bread, while Jewish youngsters yelled, pan, pan, bread, bread, and then they threw mud and dirt at the Christian bakers. And when questioned by the Inquisition, one of the Christian participants said, I quote, he did not know whether this was a rite carried out in disrespect of Christian, end of quote. So Jewish historians are more familiar with a different scenario, that of Jews having to barricade themselves in their houses during Holy Week, while processions of Christians throw stones at their homes. But in the records that Poland discovered, the roles were reversed. And it seems to confirm, as historian David Nuremberg argued in Communities of Violence, that ritual violence was not the same as sudden and malicious attacks on Jewish communities. When violence was ritualized and confined to a yearly event, it was less likely to erupt in uncontrolled attacks on the Jews. And so ritualized violence helped regulate relations between the two groups. And in the end of Passover celebration in the ghetto of Venice, food played a central role. Right? The Jews' return from matzah to bread was the occasion for a very unique reversal of roles that maybe, right, just once a year temporarily relieved the difficulties of ghetto life. But despite the similarities and the sharing and the participating in each other's rituals, the Jews' diet continued to generate strong suspicion. And I would argue that this suspicion had its roots not so much in what the Jews actually ate, because in many ways they ate the same, but in ideas about Jewish food and the potential impact of that food on a person's body and soul. And some of these ideas come through very clearly in discussions of infant nutrition. A Renaissance Italian woman, at least at a certain social level, did not nurse their babies. They hired wet nurses. And this required the constant availability of lactating women. But bodily fluids, breast milk, but also blood, semen, were believed to be powerful substances, and their exchange between members of different religions was a cause for considerable anxiety. Jewish families by far preferred their babies to have their babies breastfed by Jewish women, and to Christians it was very strictly forbidden to hire Jewish networks. For as an English chaplain wrote, I quote, no sooner do their children almost creep out of their cradles, but they are taught to be idolaters. A great tyrant is custom, and a great advantage the discipline which is sucked in with the mother's milk, end of quote. Since there were far fewer Jewish women lactating at any given time, Jewish authorities were by necessity more flexible and allowed Christian women to nurse their babies. And Christian authorities were very careful and monitored these situations to make sure that Christian women were not taken advantage, but they did not forbid them. And maybe they were secretly hoping that infants nourished by the milk of Christian women would maybe more easily be persuaded to convert later on, who knows. Beliefs about the power of bodily fluids went further than breast milk, however, and reached their apex in ritual murder accusations against Jews. So in those accusations, Jews allegedly murdered a Christian boy in order to reenact Christ's suffering and then use the boy's blood to bake Passover matzah. So it was a powerful symbolic inversion of the gospel story. During the Last Supper, Jesus had offered his body and his blood to his disciples. And by literally taking him in, they professed their faith and ensured the survival of his message. In ritual murder accusation, the blood of Jesus, represented by the murdered boy's blood, was not drunk, but baked in the matzah and then ingested by the Jews. Thus the Jews destroyed the nourishment that the apostles had received and that had given life to a new religion, and then they ate the fruit of that destruction. In ritual murder accusations, the food that the Jews ate was not simply different, strange, or exotic. It was the result of lethal criminal and ungodly activity. And the Jews who went to such great lengths to remove all blood from the meat they ate were, right in an inversion again, portrayed as bloodthirsty killers. So though historians have shown that the accusation was unfounded, it nonetheless gained traction. And the most famous and probably tragic example happened at the end of the 15th century when a young boy called Simon was found dead in Trent, an Italian city at the time. And the story of how he was tortured and murdered sparked accusation and attacks of Jews across Germany. And I'm just going to show you that image that became a very popular image of Simon's torture and killing. And right, you see a group of Jews, Simon in the middle, and you see, for example, how with a knife he's draining all the blood in a recipient that will then be used to make the matzah, and that image was found in many places. So to conclude, an overview of Jewish food in Renaissance Italy must address two elements. One, what the Jews actually ate, whether it's mangiare alla giudia or eating kosher, and two, Christian beliefs about Jewish food and what Jews ate. To a large extent, Renaissance Jews and Christians shared the same food, and most of what is known today as Jewish food has deep roots in local Italian cuisines of the time. They drank the same wine, they enjoyed breaking bread together, even if it meant braving the orders of the church. And at times they even participated in each other's ritual. But this reality coexisted with strange and scary beliefs about Jewish food and its possible impact on individual Christians' religion, and also with imagined scenarios in which Jews consumed Christian blood. So food, real and imaginary, acted as both a bridge and a barrier between Jews and Christians. Thank you.